All right, now that we've finished up the French and Indian War, our next set of notes is going to be all about the causes of the Revolutionary War. What things led to America getting their independence. You're going to see that it's a series of different laws or acts. And the first one is the Sugar Act, and that happened in 1764. Molasses, guys, or sugar was used for lots of things. Molasses was in medicines, things like that. But sugar was a commodity. It's not like today where sugar is in everything. And, you know, Americans eat too much of it. But for the most part, sugar was more of a luxury item. So it didn't really affect everyone, the Sugar Act. But what was happening is that Americans were getting their sugar from French companies, English companies, Dutch companies. And England wanted colonists to buy only English products. Therefore, they actually ended up lowering the tax on a specific brand of sugar that was only from the English companies, making it the most affordable. Then they were hoping that people would stop smuggling sugar from these other companies, like French companies and Dutch companies. The problem was that a lot of colonists didn't like it because they thought it was the way of the king limiting their choices. So this act also allows for smuggling cases to be brought to special courts that didn't have juries, which also outraged a lot of the colonists at the time. All right, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act happens in 1765. This act is a tax on almost all printed materials in the colonies. Things like newspapers, pamphlets, wills, and even playing cards. Now, the Sugar Act, not everybody was really affected by that, but the Stamp Act, just about everybody was affected, because when you think about it, you know, in your everyday life, you're going to read newspapers, you're going to, you know, play cards, read pamphlets. So all colonists used these things, therefore they were all affected by the tax. Certain colonial leaders like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams called for boycotts or refusal to buy some of these British goods that allowed for these stamps. Now, the reason why it's called the Stamp Act, guys, is because once you would pay your tax, they would stamp that paper product to show that the tax has been paid on that item. All right, so ideas about who should be allowed to tax quickly spread throughout the colonies, right? Colonists thought that local governments, their colonial governments, right, the 13 different colonial governments, should be the one to levy taxes on them. But the British argued that the British Parliament over in England should be the one that levies taxes on the colonists, since they're part of the greater British Empire. Groups protested this tax. They burned effigies, right? We'll talk about what an effigy is. They marched in the streets and they destroyed the houses of British officials. After all this commotion, by 1766, Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act, or takes it away. So, which of the following did the Stamp Act not tax? Did it not tax tea, paper, wills, or playing cards? And really, it was tea was the thing it doesn't tax, which will later be taxed, and we'll get to that. All right, the Declaratory Act. That happens in 1766. It actually goes right along with the repeal of the Stamp Act. And what it says is, it says that the British Parliament has the right to tax and make all the decisions for the colonies in all cases. This was Britain's way of trying to quell that debate as to, you know, who has the right to tax. That was them saying, we have the right to tax, and here's the law that says so. Obviously, this doesn't go over well in the colonies either. The Townshend Act was the next set of taxes that came, and it was a tax on all imported goods. Anything that the colonies could not make themselves, that had to be brought in from elsewhere, would be taxed. Most notably, it taxed tea, paper, glass, and lead. More protests followed, more boycotts. Once again, this was unpopular in the colonies. And it was repealed after 3 years in 1770, except for the tax on tea. They leave that one tax thinking maybe this will help alleviate some of our debts from the French and Indian War, and maybe this, you know, the colonists will be okay if we just leave that one tax. The Quartering Act, that's in 1765, and that required innkeepers and public officials to house and feed British soldiers. In the French and Indian War, they found it hard to have places for the soldiers to stay, so this act said, well, if you own an inn, right, or you're a public official, you don't have a choice, right? Our soldiers can stay with you. The Tea Act of 1773, this act gave one British tea company, the East India Company, an unfair advantage in selling their tea products. It basically allowed for that company to have a monopoly or control all the tea being imported into the 13 colonies. This caused one British tea brand to be much cheaper, right, and limited the choices of the others, sort of like the Sugar Act. Colonists didn't like the idea of their tea choices being limited, right? So it became an example of Britain trying to control their everyday lives. Think of it today like the United States government says you can only drink Pepsi and no Coke products, right? That would upset a lot of people. Why is the government telling me what choices I should be able to have? So in the Boston Harbor in December of 1773, the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, and they threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, I also tell kids, don't think so much about tea as being, tea, who cares, right? Tea was an expensive commodity back then, so it would be almost the equivalent of throwing crates of, iPhones or something into the ocean. So the king vowed to punish Great Britain for this act. How dare they defy the king and cause all this destruction? And here's a quick little video for you guys to watch.
The growing resentment of the colonists against British control culminated in a dramatic display of rebellion in Boston Harbor called the Boston Tea Party. It all started in 1773, when Britain wanted to save one of its prominent companies, the East India Tea Company, from bankruptcy. It allowed that company to sell surplus tea directly to colonists, bypassing colonial merchants along the way. The colonists were furious. As they saw it, Britain was trying to give a British company a monopoly on American soil. And by bypassing the American tea merchants who traditionally collected taxes, it was cheating the Americans out of money. The colonists decided to boycott East India tea, but for some colonists, a boycott didn't go far enough. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, a vigilante group intent on protecting colonial rights, saw the tax on tea as an opportunity to rally support against British rule. Adams had organized groups of colonial patriots throughout the colonies to exchange information and monitor British activities. They were called the Committees of Correspondence and would be crucial in setting up the Boston Tea Party.
Sam proceeded to set up these committees of correspondence. They started writing back and forth in the different colonies, saying we must stop this. He worked everybody up into quite a state of anger. And when the tea finally arrived, the tax tea from the East India Company, Sam was ready.
In Boston, the unpopular governor, Thomas Hutchinson, an American appointed by the Crown, ordered the ships to remain in the harbor until the tea was unloaded. On December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty organized about 100 Bostonians, disguised themselves as Indians, and boarded the ships.
They chopped open the tea and threw them all into Boston Harbor, destroying quite a lot of money.
Onlookers cheered as Boston Harbor became an enormous teapot. Governor Hutchinson fled the city, never to return. Not a single ounce of the several thousand chests of tea shipped by the East India Company ever reached colonial stores.
There were tea parties in other colonies, but nothing quite as dramatic and as expensive as the Boston Tea Party.
In Philadelphia and New York, mass demonstrations forced tea-bearing ships to return to England with their cargo holds still full. In Annapolis, protesters burned both the tea and the ships, chanting liberty and independence, or death in pursuit. Outside of Massachusetts, radical colonists burned tea leaves in solidarity with Boston. Others shook their heads at the destruction of private property and the breakdown of law. The British Parliament was outraged by this blatant act of rebellion and proceeded to slap the colonists with a new set of laws called the Intolerable Acts. They were designed to bring the colonists to their knees, but instead spurred them closer to the battle for independence.
Okay, so like the video was saying, the Intolerable Acts was technically called the Coercive Acts of 1774. This act closed the Boston Harbor until Bostonians paid for the ruined tea. While it was closed, the people of Boston couldn't receive any goods. This was devastating to the citizens of Boston. The law banned town meetings and all protests, right? While the port was closed, goods couldn't come in or out of Boston. People in Boston found it much harder to get food, to make money, all that kinds of things. So this really causes an economic collapse, not just in Boston, but in all the port cities as a result of what's happening in Boston. So the colonists renamed these Coercive Acts the Intolerable Act, right? It was so bad it's not even tolerable. And there's our little picture of our angry king there. All right, so which of these acts do you believe was the most damaging to the colonies? The Stamp Act, the Intolerable Act, the Quartering Act, or the Townshend Act? Obviously, guys, for this, there is no right or wrong answer. It's really just your opinion, so whichever one you choose there. All right, one more video. This one is a Schoolhouse Rock, so enjoy. All right, so real quick, force the colonists to allow troops into their home. That would be the Quartering Act here. Placed a tax on all printed materials. That is the Stamp Act. Lowered the tax on molasses in hope that smuggling would stop. That would be the Sugar Act. Closed Boston Harbor and banned town meetings. That's the Intolerable Act. Allowed the British to make all the decisions for the colonies. That's the Declaratory Act. Taxed all imported goods. That's the Townshend Act. No selling west of the Appalachian Mountains is the Proclamation of 1763, and lowered the tax on one brand of tea, which limited the colonists' choices. That is the Tea Act. All right, and what is not true of the Boston Tea Party? It failed to get the king's attention, happened in 1773, organized the Sons of Liberty, protest over the king, limiting their options. Obviously, guys, the answer for this is failed to get the king's attention, because clearly it did get the king's attention, because he put into effect the Intolerable Acts. Okay? And that is it.